Husband sold his blood twice a week for 5 years, so his wife could finish medical school. At her graduation, she thanked a different man. Before we begin, if you believe that loyalty should never be forgotten and sacrifice always leaves a mark, go ahead and subscribe to this channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Now, settle in. This one is going to stay with you. When Osei walked into that graduation hall, he carried 5 years of needle marks on both arms. His wife stood at the podium in a white coat he had bled for. Literally, she thanked a man named Julian. Osei didn't flinch. He had already spoken to an attorney that morning. The auditorium smelled like fresh flowers and old wood. Late May in Memphis, and the heat had already settled into everything. The chairs, the walls, the silk scarves wrapped around the necks of proud mothers sitting in the front rows. The medical school had decorated the stage with white bunting and gold letters that spelled out a year most of these families had been waiting on for nearly a decade. It was a day built for joy, and for most of the people inside that room, joy was exactly what they felt. Osei Mensah sat in the third row. His suit was borrowed, a navy blue 2-button that belonged to his older brother Kofi, who was broader in the shoulders and shorter in the arms. Osei had rolled the cuffs just enough to make it work. He sat with his hands folded in his lap, his posture still, his expression calm. If you looked at him from a distance, you might think he was a man at peace. But peace was not what lived inside Osei that morning. What lived inside him was arithmetic. 5 years, 104 weeks per year, 2 visits per week to the BioLife Plasma Services Center on Poplar Avenue, each visit lasting between 45 minutes and an hour, depending on how fast the machine cycled. Each session paying somewhere between $50 and $75, depending on the promotion schedule and whether it was his first or second donation of the week. He had done the math so many times that the numbers no longer felt like numbers. They felt like pulse, like rhythm, like the thing that kept him moving when nothing else did. His wife, Nadine, was somewhere behind the stage. He had not seen her that morning. She had left the apartment before dawn, telling him she needed to be there early for the processional lineup. She kissed his forehead on the way out. It was a quick kiss, the kind you give to a piece of furniture you pass on the way to the door. Osei noticed. He always noticed. He had simply trained himself not to react. In his jacket pocket, tucked inside the breastfold where a handkerchief might go, there was a manila envelope. It was thin, just a few pages, but its weight was something only Osei understood. He had driven to the FedEx office on Union Avenue 2 days earlier to print everything. The clerk behind the counter asked if he needed binding. Osei said no. He said it softly, almost to himself. No, this doesn't need to be bound, it just needs to be handed over. The ceremony hadn't started yet, but Osei could already feel the ending. Not in his gut. He didn't trust his gut anymore. He felt it in the way the room was arranged. Nadine's family had filled the rows behind him. Her mother, Francine, her sister, Ya, her 2 aunts from Mobile, who drove up the night before. They sat together in a cluster, talking and laughing and adjusting each other's hats. Not one of them had saved him a seat. He found his own, 3rd row, aisle, alone. That told him everything he needed to know. But then again, Osei had known for months, maybe longer than months, maybe since the evening Nadine stopped saying his name the way she used to, like it was something she was glad to hold in her mouth. Somewhere along the way, his name and her voice had become a formality, a placeholder, the sound of obligation, not affection. The envelope in his pocket was not born from anger. It was born from clarity, and clarity, once it arrives, does not leave. It sits in the chest, like a second heartbeat, steady and unignorable, reminding you of what you already know but were too afraid to confirm. 5 years earlier, Osei Mensah married Nadine Okafor in a small ceremony at Greater Hope Baptist Church on the south side of Memphis. Pastor Nkrumah officiated. Abena Mensah, Osei's mother, sat in the front pew and cried the way Only a woman who raised 4 sons alone knows how to cry. Silently, with her chin up, she had buried Osei's father, Emmanuel, when Osei was 11. Emmanuel was a quiet man who drove a delivery truck for a linen company and never missed a Sunday. He left behind no wealth, no property, and no complaints. What he left behind was a way of being, and Osei inherited every ounce of it. Nadine was brilliant. Everyone said so, and everyone was right. She had finished her undergraduate degree at the University of Memphis with honors, worked 2 years as a medical assistant at a pediatric clinic, and then received her acceptance letter to Meharry Medical College in Nashville. The letter arrived 6 months after the wedding. Osei remembered the evening she opened it. She screamed, she jumped, she cried into his chest, and then she got quiet, because they both knew what it meant. Medical school was not a dream that fit inside a warehouse salary. Osei worked as a logistics coordinator at a distribution center near the airport. It was steady work, loading schedules, inventory counts, shift rotations. He was good at it. His supervisor, a man named Charles Boateng, told him once that Osei was the most reliable person on the floor. Osei didn't take the compliment personally. Reliability wasn't a personality trait for him. It was architecture. It was the only thing he knew how to build. The numbers didn't work. Nadine's tuition, even with partial scholarships, ran close to $40,000 a year. Add books, board exams, licensing prep courses, and living expenses, and the gap between what Osei earned and what the dream cost was a canyon. Nadine's family offered encouragement. Her mother, Francine, called weekly to say how proud she was. Her sister, Ya, sent gift cards and long text messages filled with prayer emojis. But pride and gift cards do not cover tuition installments. Osei's mother, Abena, sat him down at her kitchen table one Sunday after church. She made him a plate of jollof rice and fried plantain and set it in front of him without a word. Then she sat across from him and said what she always said when the situation was serious. "You chose her. Now you carry it." Osei didn't argue. He never argued with his mother. Not because he was weak, but because Abena Mensa had a way of saying things that left no room for argument. She wasn't harsh. She was finished. When she spoke, the sentence was already complete. The Plasma Center on Poplar Avenue was a beige building sandwiched between a payday loan office and a tire shop. Osei drove past it every day on his way to work. One Tuesday in September, 6 months into Nadine's first year, he pulled into the parking lot instead of driving past. He sat in his truck for 9 minutes. Then he went inside. The process was clinical. They checked his vitals, pricked his finger, weighed him, and ran him through a questionnaire. Then they inserted the needle, and the machine did its work, pulling blood, separating the plasma, and returning the red cells. It took about an hour. They paid him $62. He drove home and told Nadine the overtime had been good that week. He went back on Thursday, and then the following Tuesday, and Thursday again, week after week, month after month, year after year. The staff at the center came to know him by name. Brenda, the intake nurse with the reading glasses on a beaded chain, started calling him Mr. Tuesday Thursday. She said it with a smile, like it was a compliment. Osei smiled back and never corrected her. He didn't tell her that some mornings he sat in his truck for 5 minutes before walking in because his arms were still sore from the last session. He didn't mention that the iron supplements he took every night made his stomach turn. He didn't explain that. On the drive home, he sometimes had to pull over because the dizziness hit him like a wave. Every session was logged. Every payment deposited into a separate checking account he opened at a credit union across town. An account Nadine didn't know about. Not because he was hiding money from her, but because the money wasn't really his. It was hers. It just passed through his veins first. Abena was the only person who knew. She never asked him to stop. She never praised him for it. What she did say one evening while washing dishes at her sink was this: "Always keep paper, baby. Love don't need receipts, but life does." Osei listened. He created a folder, a physical one, kept in a filing cabinet in the back of their bedroom closet. Every plasma receipt, every tuition payment confirmation, every bank transfer, a spreadsheet updated monthly, handwritten in blue ink. Over 5 years, the total would climb past $83,000. He never told Nadine. She never asked where the extra money came from, and Osei told himself that her not asking was trust. He told himself that for a long time. The physical toll was cumulative. By the end of the second year, Osei had lost 14 pounds. His complexion, once rich and even, had taken on a grayish undertone that he attributed to long hours at the warehouse. He bruised more easily. A bump against a shelf at work would leave a mark that lasted 2 weeks. His brother Kofi asked him once if he was eating enough. Osei said yes and changed the subject. His co-worker, a man named Desmond, told him he looked tired. Osei said it was just the schedule. He had become fluent in the language of deflection, not because he was ashamed, but because the truth would have required an explanation he wasn't willing to give. Nadine, to her credit, was working hard. She was making sacrifices of her own: the long hours, the emotional weight of clinical training, the constant evaluation. Osei respected that. He never minimized what she was going through. But there was a difference between their sacrifices that neither of them acknowledged out loud. Nadine's sacrifice was building toward something visible: a degree, a title, a white coat with her name embroidered on the pocket. Osei's sacrifice was invisible by design. It happened in a beige building twice a week, and it disappeared into bank transfers that had no name attached. The shift began in Nadine's third year. It was not dramatic. It was not a single moment or a single choice. It was more like weather, the kind that changes so slowly you don't realize you're wet until you're soaked. Nadine's clinical rotation started that fall. She was assigned to the internal medicine unit at Vanderbilt, and suddenly her world expanded in ways that Osei's could not follow. She came home late, which was expected. She studied on weekends, which was necessary. But the texture of her absence changed. She used to call Osei on her breaks. A quick 2-minute conversation that meant nothing and everything. "How's your day? I miss you. Save me some food." Those calls slowed to texts, then to silence. She wasn't being cruel. She was simply moving through a door that didn't have room for both of them. Julian Adeyemi entered her life the way most consequential people do, without announcement. He was a 4th-year resident in internal medicine. Nigerian-American. Tall, confident in the way that only people born into professional families can be. His father was a cardiologist. His mother was a pharmacist. Julian had grown up in rooms where medicine was the family language, and it showed. He mentored Nadine through her rotation, corrected her charting, reviewed her presentations, and told her she had the instinct of someone who belonged in academic medicine. No one had ever said that to her before. Certainly not Osei, who wouldn't have known what academic medicine meant if you handed him a definition. Osei first heard Julian's name at dinner on a Wednesday evening. Nadine was eating leftover stew and scrolling her phone when she said casually, "Julian thinks I should apply to the nephrology fellowship at Emory." Osei asked who Julian was. Nadine said, "My attending," and kept scrolling. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds. But the name landed in Osei's chest like a stone dropped in still water. And the ripples didn't stop. Over the next several months, Julian's name appeared more often. Julian said this about her case presentation. Julian recommended that journal article. Julian thought she should attend the conference in Atlanta. Each mention was small, casual, and ordinary. But Osei noticed the way Nadine said his name, with a tone she used to reserve for things she believed in. The disrespect, when it came, was not loud. It never is in situations like this. It arrived in small, accumulating gestures that each, on their own, could be explained away. But together, they formed a pattern that only a man paying very close attention could see. And Osei was paying very close attention, because attention was all he had left to give. Nadine missed 2 Sunday dinners at Abena's house in a row. The first time she said she had a study group. The second time, she didn't offer an explanation at all. Abena didn't say anything to Nadine. She said it to Osei in the kitchen while wrapping up a plate for him to take home. That girl is already gone in her mind. She's just waiting for her body to follow. Osei shook his head. He couldn't afford to believe it. Not after everything he had given. At a small gathering with Nadine's classmates, a birthday dinner at a restaurant in Germantown, Nadine corrected Osei's pronunciation of a medical term in front of the table. The word was nephrology. Osei had said it slightly wrong, placing the emphasis on the wrong syllable. Nadine corrected him quickly, almost reflexively, the way you'd correct a child. The table went quiet for a half-second, then moved on. Osei smiled. He ate his food. He drove home. He said nothing. She stopped asking about his work entirely. Not gradually. It was as if a switch had been turned. She no longer asked how his day was. She no longer asked about Charles Boateng or the warehouse or the shift schedule. Her silence on the subject wasn't hostile. It was the silence of someone who had simply reclassified the person across from her. He was no longer a partner. He was infrastructure. You don't ask the foundation how its day went. One Thursday evening in February, Osei drove to the plasma center as he always did. He parked in the same spot, 3rd row, near the fire hydrant. He turned off the engine, and for the first time in 5 years, he didn't get out immediately. He sat there for 11 minutes. He knew it was 11 minutes because he watched the clock on the dashboard. He wasn't thinking about Nadine, exactly. He was thinking about himself, about the version of himself that had walked into this building 500 times and walked out lighter, literally and figuratively, each time. He was wondering if it still mattered. He went in anyway. He always went in. What Nadine didn't understand, what she couldn't have understood, because she never asked, was that the plasma center had become more than a financial strategy for Osei. It had become a ritual, a private church where the offering was literal. Twice a week, he sat in a reclining chair and let a machine take something from his body so that someone else's dream could stay alive. There was a strange holiness to it that he never spoke about, and a strange loneliness too, because no one knew, and the person it was all for had stopped seeing him clearly enough to wonder. The rehearsal dinner happened 3 days before graduation. Nadine's program hosted it at a restaurant near campus. A long table, white tablecloths, toasts from faculty, and the specific kind of laughter that comes from people who have survived something difficult together. Osei was invited. He attended. He wore a pressed shirt and sat at the end of the table, near the breadbasket. Julian Adeyemi was seated next to Nadine. This was not assigned seating. This was choice. And Osei watched the choice play out across the evening the way a man watches weather he cannot change. Their shoulders angled toward each other. Their laughter overlapped in that half-second way that indicates private understanding. Julian touched Nadine's wrist once, briefly to make a point about something, and she didn't pull away. She didn't even notice, which meant she was used to it. Osei drove home alone. Nadine stayed to help clean up, she said. He didn't ask when she'd be back. He stopped asking questions he already knew the answers to sometime around month 37. The next morning, while Nadine was in the shower, Osei sat down at the kitchen table with his laptop. He didn't plan to look at her computer, but it was open. The screen was on, and the document that was open was her graduation speech draft. He read it once, then he read it again. The speech was 3 pages long. It was well written. Nadine had always been a strong writer. She thanked her professors by name. She thanked the program director. She thanked her cohort for their solidarity. And then, in the closing paragraph, she wrote this: "And to Dr. Julian Adeyemi, whose mentorship changed the trajectory of my career and my life. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. I carry your words with me into every room I enter as a physician." Osei's name appeared once, in a parenthetical cluster near the end. "To my family and loved ones, my mother, my sister Ya, my husband Osei. Thank you for your patience and support." That was it. 5 years of plasma centers and split shifts and iron supplements and bruised veins, reduced to a name in a list, between a mother-in-law and a thank you. Osei closed the laptop. He did not slam it. He did not feel rage. What he felt was something much more dangerous than rage. He felt certainty. That afternoon, while Nadine was at her final fitting for her white coat, Osei went to the bedroom closet. He pulled out the filing cabinet. He opened the folder. 5 years of documentation stared back at him. Organized, dated, totaled. 512 plasma donation receipts. 478 tuition and exam-related payments. Bank transfer confirmations. A handwritten spreadsheet with a running total in the bottom right corner. $83,417. Every cent earned from his blood or redirected from his paycheck. Every cent spent on her dream. He sat on the edge of the bed and held the folder on his lap. He didn't cry. Crying would have meant he was surprised, and he was not surprised. He was confirmed. There is a difference between heartbreak and confirmation. Heartbreak comes from the unexpected. Confirmation comes from the slow, patient assembly of evidence that the thing you feared was true has always been true. And confirmation, unlike heartbreak, does not weaken you, it arms you. Osei sat there for a long time. When he finally stood, he stood like a man who had made a decision that nothing, not love, not memory, not the ache in his arms, could undo. The next call he made was to Kwame Asante. Kwame was a family attorney who worked out of a small office on Lamar Avenue. He was also a longtime member of Greater Hope Baptist, where Abena Mensah had been a deaconess for 22 years. Kwame had known Osei since he was a boy. When Osei called and asked if they could meet that afternoon, Kwame didn't ask why. He just said, "Come on." Osei sat in Kwame's office, with the folder open on the desk between them. Kwame put on his reading glasses and went through every page. He didn't rush. He asked questions. He made notes on a yellow legal pad. When he was done, he leaned back in his chair and took off his glasses. Under Tennessee marital property law, Kwame said, documented financial contributions made by one spouse toward the education or professional development of the other, especially contributions of this magnitude and consistency, create a strong basis for equitable restitution in divorce proceedings. This isn't ambiguous, Osei. You don't need to fight. You just need to file correctly. Osei nodded. He didn't ask about timelines or strategy. He asked one question. Can you have the papers ready by Saturday morning? Kwame looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, I'll have them ready by Friday night. Osei drove home. He put the folder back in the closet. He made dinner. When Nadine came home, he asked how the fitting went. She said it went fine. They ate in the kind of silence that holds everything and says nothing. That night, Osei slept better than he had in months. Graduation morning arrived the way all inevitable mornings do, slowly, and then all at once. Memphis was already warm by 8 o'clock. The sky was flat and pale. Osei ironed his brother's suit, knotted his tie in the mirror, and placed the manila envelope in his breast pocket. He ate a piece of toast standing at the kitchen counter. He drank 1 cup of coffee. Then he drove to the auditorium alone. The ceremony was long, 14 speakers, 2 musical performances, a keynote from a retired surgeon who told the graduates that medicine was not a career, but a covenant. Osei listened to all of it. He sat very still. When Nadine's name was called, he watched her walk across the stage. Her white coat was crisp. Her heels clicked on the hardwood. She was smiling, the kind of smile that comes from having arrived somewhere you were not always sure you would reach. She had earned this moment. Osei knew that. He had helped build the road she walked on. He also knew that roads don't get thanked. They just get used. Then came the commencement reflections. 3 graduates had been selected to speak. Nadine was the second. She approached the podium with her notes, though she barely looked at them. She spoke about the long nights, the self-doubt, the patience who taught her more than any textbook could. She thanked her professors. She thanked the program staff. She thanked her cohort. And then her voice softened, just slightly, the way it does when someone is about to say something they have rehearsed in front of a mirror. And to Dr. Julian Adeyemi, she said, whose mentorship changed the trajectory of my career and my life. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. I carry your words with me into every room I enter as a physician. The audience applauded. Julian Adeyemi, seated 3 rows from the front with a group of residents, stood briefly and nodded. Nadine's eyes found him. Not the crowd, not her family, not the 3rd row where her husband sat with his hands folded. She found Julian. Osei did not move. His face did not change. Somewhere inside his chest, a door that had been closing for 5 years finally shut. It made no sound. After the ceremony, the reception was held in the atrium. White tablecloths, sparkling cider, clusters of families posing for photographs. Osei moved through the crowd like a man who had already left the building, but whose body hadn't caught up yet. He shook hands. He accepted congratulations meant for Nadine. He smiled when people told him he must be so proud. Nadine found him near the refreshment table. She hugged him, quickly, publicly, the kind of embrace meant to be seen more than felt. Thank you for being here, she said. Not thank you for everything. Not I couldn't have done this without you. Not even I love you. Just thank you for being here. As though his presence were a courtesy and not a cost. Osei excused himself. He said he needed to get something from the car. He walked across the parking lot in the May heat, his brother's suit jacket absorbing the sun. He opened the passenger door. He picked up the manila envelope from the center console. He walked back inside. He found Nadine standing with her mother, her sister Ya, and 2 classmates. Julian was nearby talking to a faculty member. Osei walked up to Nadine calmly. He did not raise his voice. He did not create a scene. He simply extended the envelope and said, "This is for you." Nadine looked at the envelope, then at him. She took it with a half smile, as though it might be a graduation card. She opened it. The first page was the divorce petition. The second was a summary of financial contributions, dated, categorized, and totaled. The third was a printout of every plasma donation Osei had made over 5 years, dates, locations, amounts received, and, in a column he had added by hand, the physical side effects he experienced after each session. Dizziness, fatigue, bruising, nausea, iron deficiency. He had logged them all. The final page was a handwritten note. It said, "I bled for this, literally. I hope it was worth it." Nadine's face changed. It did not collapse. It did not harden. It simply reorganized, the way a face does when it encounters a truth it has been outrunning. She looked up at Osei. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. Not because she had nothing to say, but because everything she could say was already answered by the papers in her hands. Julian Adeyemi noticed the shift. He took a half step forward, the way people do when they sense they should intervene, but don't understand the situation well enough to know how. Osei looked at him, once briefly, without hostility or aggression. Just a look. A still, measured look that carried the full weight of 5 years of needles and silence and Tuesday and Thursday appointments that no one ever asked about. Julian stopped. He didn't step back. He just stopped. And in that stopping, he understood that he was standing in a story that was never his to enter. Osei turned and walked toward the exit. He did not run. He did not look back. His footsteps echoed in the atrium, steady, rhythmic, and final. Behind him, the celebration continued. But the air in Nadine's immediate circle had changed. The people standing near her could feel it, even if they didn't know what was in the envelope. Something had shifted. Something irreversible had passed between two people, and the room had absorbed it, the way still water absorbs a stone. Nadine's mother, Francine, reached for the papers. Nadine pulled them away. Not sharply, instinctively, the way a person protects something that implicates them. Francine looked at her daughter's face and knew, in the way that mothers know without being told, that whatever was in that envelope was not a gift. It was an ending. Ya, standing beside their mother, said nothing. She looked toward the exit where Osei had disappeared, and for the first time in 5 years, she wondered what it had actually cost him to stand behind her sister. She had always admired Nadine's ambition. She had never once asked about the structure that held it up. The reception continued. People laughed, cameras flashed, graduates hugged their families and posed with their white coats spread open like wings. But in the corner, near the refreshment table, where Nadine stood holding a manila envelope with both hands, the celebration had already ended. She just hadn't told anyone yet. The weeks that followed were not dramatic. That is the thing people misunderstand about collapse. They expect it to be loud. They expect wreckage and confrontation and raised voices behind closed doors. But the end of Osei and Nadine's marriage was none of those things. It was procedural. It was quiet. It was the slow, systemic unraveling of a structure that had been bearing weight on one side for far too long. Kwame Asante filed the papers on the Monday after graduation. The documentation was meticulous. 5 years of records organized with the kind of precision that courts respect more than emotion. The judge who reviewed the initial filing reportedly paused on the plasma donation logs. She asked Kwame if the records had been verified. They had. Every entry corresponded to a transaction on file with BioLife Plasma Services. Under Tennessee's equitable distribution statute, the court recognized Osei's financial contributions as marital property, directed toward the enhancement of Nadine's earning capacity. The ruling did not bankrupt Nadine. It did not punish her. But it established that Osei's sacrifice, documented, sustained, and unreturned, entitled him to meaningful restitution. A portion of Nadine's future physician income would be garnished monthly for a period determined by the court. The math was simple. The message was simpler. What is given must be accounted for. Julian Adeyemi, for his part, faded quickly. Once the details of Osei's sacrifice began to circulate among Nadine's medical community, not through gossip, but through the inevitable arithmetic of human observation, Julian found himself standing in an uncomfortable light. The mentorship he had offered Nadine, whatever its true nature, was not built to withstand scrutiny. Their connection, which had felt so organic in the protected world of clinical rotations and late-night study sessions, did not survive contact with the full context of what had been happening on the other side of Nadine's life. Within 4 months, Julian accepted a transfer to a residency program in another city. He didn't say goodbye to Nadine. He simply left. And in his leaving, he confirmed what Osei had suspected all along, that Julian was never a destination. He was an exit. Abena Mensah never spoke publicly about her son's divorce. She didn't need to. The community at Greater Hope Baptist had its own nervous system. A network of Sunday dinners, Wednesday Bible studies, and Saturday morning phone calls that carried information without ever raising a voice. The Deaconess Board, of which Abena had been a member for over 2 decades, knew the story within weeks. Not because Abena told it, but because she didn't deny it when asked. And her silence, as always, spoke louder than any words could have. When Sister Nana asked Abena after service, one Sunday, if Osei was doing all right, Abena simply said, "My son is standing." That was all she needed to say. The women of Greater Hope understood that standing, in Abena's vocabulary, meant surviving with your dignity intact. It meant the floor had tried to open beneath you and you had refused to fall. Nadine's family pulled back in degrees. Her mother, Francine, who had once called weekly to celebrate Nadine's accomplishments, now called less often. When she did call, the conversations were shorter and the pauses were longer. Her sister Ya, who had once defended Nadine's independence and drive, went quiet altogether. The silence around Nadine grew, not like a punishment but like a natural consequence, like shade moving across a yard as the sun shifts. Nadine completed her residency. She matched into a solid program. She became, by all professional measures, a competent and capable physician. The dream she had chased was real, and she had earned it. No one could take that from her, but the personal cost followed her like a second shadow. In the hospital, she was respected. In her personal life, she was increasingly alone. She had traded something she didn't fully understand the value of until it was gone, and the realization came not in a single moment of regret, but in 1,000 small ones. Eating dinner alone, driving home to an empty apartment, scrolling through photos of a life that no longer existed. There was no revenge in any of this. Osei did not orchestrate her isolation. He did not spread stories. He did not weaponize his pain. He simply told the truth, once in a single envelope, and let the truth do what truth always does when it is documented and undeniable. It moves through the world on its own. It doesn't need a spokesperson. It just needs paper. People tried to reach out to Osei in the months that followed. Nadine's classmates, colleagues who had been at the reception, even a few of Nadine's family members who felt compelled by guilt or curiosity. Osei didn't engage, not because he was cold, but because there was nothing left to discuss. The folder had said everything he needed to say. The court had handled the rest. He had no interest in becoming the protagonist of other people's outrage. He wasn't a story to be retold at dinner tables. He was a man who had bled quietly for 5 years and then, when the time came, had presented the receipt. 18 months later, on a Saturday morning in October, Osei Mensah stood in the kitchen of his apartment, a small one-bedroom off Summer Avenue, and made breakfast. Eggs, toast, turkey sausage, coffee in a mug that said Memphis on the side, a gift from his brother Kofi. The apartment was clean. The windows were open. The air smelled like fall. He had gained weight. Not much, 12, maybe 15 pounds, but enough to fill out the spaces that 5 years of blood loss had hollowed. His arms still carried the faint scars of 1,000 needle entries, faded now to thin white lines that caught the light only at certain angles. He didn't hide them. He didn't display them. They were simply part of him, the way a tree carries the rings of its history inside its trunk. He still worked at the warehouse. Charles Boateng had promoted him to shift lead the previous spring. A small bump in pay, a slightly larger office, and the quiet satisfaction of being trusted with more. Osei didn't dream about the promotion at night. He didn't celebrate it beyond thanking Charles and buying a round of coffee for the morning crew. He had learned, somewhere in the middle of those 5 years, that the things worth having don't announce themselves. They just arrive, steady and unspectacular, like daylight. He had not remarried. He had not dated. Not because he was broken or bitter, but because he was still learning to recognize himself without the context of sacrifice. For so long, his identity had been the man who gave, the man who bled, the man who carried the weight without asking anyone to notice. Without that weight, why, he felt lighter, but also unfamiliar, like a house that has been renovated and doesn't yet know its own layout. His mother called at 9:15, as she always did on Saturdays. She didn't ask about Nadine. She hadn't mentioned Nadine's name in over a year. She asked Osei if he had eaten. He said yes. She asked if he was going to church tomorrow. He said probably. She said, good. Then she told him about the new choir director at Greater Hope and how Sister Delphine had brought potato salad to the potluck that tasted like it had been made in anger. Osei laughed. It was a real laugh, not the kind he used to produce to keep the peace, but the kind that comes from the belly when something is genuinely funny. After he hung up, Osei sat at the kitchen table and looked out the window. The trees on Summer Avenue were beginning to turn, gold and amber, and a deep, burnt red that Memphis produces only in October. He thought about Nadine, briefly, not with resentment and not with love, but with the kind of distant clarity that comes when a wound has healed and the scar tissue has settled. He didn't hate her. He didn't miss her. He understood her, which was something different entirely. She had chased a dream and lost track of who was holding the ladder. It was not a unique story. It was, in fact, one of the oldest stories there is. He thought about Julian, even more briefly. Julian was never the problem. Julian was a symptom, a mirror that reflected back to Nadine, the version of herself she wanted to become. Osei couldn't compete with that, and he had stopped trying long before the graduation. You cannot compete with someone's idea of their future self. You can only stand beside them and hope they still see you when they arrive. He thought about the version of himself who sat in the Plasma Center parking lot on that Thursday evening. 11 minutes of silence before walking in. He wished he could go back and sit in the passenger seat next to that man. He wouldn't tell him to stop. He wouldn't tell him it wasn't worth it. He would just say, it mattered. What you're doing matters, just not to who you think. And one day the person it matters to most will be you. There is a particular kind of grief that belongs to men who gave everything and were thanked with a line in a list. It is not loud grief. It does not show up in courtrooms or therapists' offices or late-night phone calls to old friends. It shows up in the quiet moments, in the space between putting down a coffee mug and picking up a car key. In the half-second before sleep when the mind replays a moment that should have gone differently. Osei carried this grief the way his father, Emmanuel, had carried everything. Close to the chest, without complaint, and with the understanding that some things are simply too heavy to put down. You just learn to walk with them. But grief, Osei had learned, is not permanent if you let it move through you instead of building a home inside you. And, slowly, week by week, he let it move. He didn't replace it with anything. He just let the space it occupied become empty, and then he let the emptiness become its own kind of peace. Osei washed his breakfast plate, dried it, and put it away. He wiped down the counter. He folded the dish towel and hung it over the oven handle. These small domestic rituals, which once felt like the invisible labor of a man nobody noticed, now felt like something else entirely. They felt like sovereignty, like a man taking care of his own space because it was his and because the care itself was enough. Some people build monuments to their sacrifices. They tell the story at every dinner party. They hold it over people like a lantern meant to illuminate their own nobility. Osei Mensah built a folder, a plain manila folder in a filing cabinet in the back of a closet. He updated it with blue ink on the last Sunday of every month. He didn't build it to be seen. He built it because his mother told him to. And when the time came, when the truth needed to be delivered without screaming or spectacle, that folder spoke louder than any speech from any podium ever could. Dignity is not performed. It is documented, and when the document speaks, even the room that tried to forget you has no choice but to listen. If this story reminded you that silence can carry more weight than any words, go ahead and share it with someone who needs to hear that today. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. because the stories we tell here are about the people who are overlooked, underestimated, and quietly powerful, and those stories deserve to be heard. Until next time.